Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and welcome to my very first point horror novel review. I decided to go ahead and make a review on this book because, like point horror, Fear Street is also another popular thing that R.L. Stine has done. And on this channel, I decided to kind of marry Fear Street and point horror into Fear Street shorts. And I'll only ever make reviews if there's really bad ones or really, really good ones I loved. And this one happens to be one I love, and it's called Beach House. Now, Beach House was recommended to me by quite a few folks, and I've heard there are some other great authors in the point horror series. However, on this channel, I'm not going to be covering those other authors. I'm going to be doing reviews on my sister channel, Horror FFA, for those. I decided to keep this one for R.L. Stine specifically with young adult, in very, very rare exceptions, if the names are tied to Goosebumps in some way. So if you're not subbed up to Horror Free For All or anything, I'll put a link in the description and in the comment section down below, so you all can go sub up that channel and stay tuned if I ever do drop reviews. I am trying to do more young adult and adult book reviews on that channel. It just takes a lot of reading time to do so. So thank you in advance for doing that. Now, Beach House. Like I said, I heard a lot of great things about it, but I was not expecting the ambitiousness that I got from this book. This book made me really appreciate R.L. Stine and the young adult thriller genre as a whole, especially the 90s ones, because let's face it, Fear Street, point horror, they all have this stigma that it's trashy, cheesy 90s garb in a sense. When we're discussing, young adult stuff, fiction, whatnot, you have teen drama, melodrama, stuff like that. And this book is filled with it, but it's so enjoyable. Like, if I had to pick a poster child book that does teen drama right, or in a fun and entertaining way, it's this book, just for how the characters are written, and Stine's ability to make you love and simultaneously hate every single character. It makes it for a fun and enjoyable experience. And it reminds me of all the great young adult shows that I've watched over the years where I found myself in the same exact situation. And this reminded me of like a Lifetime original thriller movie, not quite a theatrical film, but this has movie quality writing to Stine. And I don't mean that as an insult by any means. I really think that some of Stine's best writing I've ever read from him is in this book. The prose, or the prose, if you want to call it that, just the how illicit these scenes were and how descriptive they were, and how Stine was able to immerse the reader into the atmosphere and the setting of this story was just breathtaking. And the way the story is laid out is enthralling as well. You have multiple different, well, not multiple, but multiple changes of two different time periods going throughout the book. And we'll get into that shortly. But I was not expecting it to be as well woven as it was. And by the climax, how those timelines tie together, I think was just so bombastic. If you guys have not checked out Beach House before, and maybe you're apprehensive on reading young adult stuff or anything Fear Street by R.L. Stine, or maybe you just been on a string of bad luck trying young adult R.L. Stine and you haven't tried this, try this one out. I really think this book will be a home run for most people. I have yet to see reviews online say anything negative about this. So yeah, let's get right into it. So, this whole book takes place in the town called Dunehampton. And Dunehampton is like this beach town, I guess, in the Northeast. They mention it's nearby Vermont. I'm guessing it's over in like New York somewhere. And it's like very cold, water all the time, even in like the heart of summer. And it's, you get this sense of atmosphere almost off the bat of what it's like. And Stine starts off the story in 1956 with this main character named Maria. You don't really get Maria's perspective because how the book is formatted, you get a third person kind of situation with her character. But you get to meet Maria and her friends. And, she has a good friend named Amy. And there's these two other guys, Robbie and some other guy I forget his name of. And they're all hanging out at the beach in Dunehampton. making some jokes. And there's this boy named Buddy who happens to be staying at this really creepy beach house that's very close to the beach. I don't know if you can see it on the cover, but it's like, that's how it's described. It's like on the beach right by the water. It's unusually close to the water. And Buddy's happened to be staying there, and Maria's taken a like to him. But all of her friends think that he's kind of weird. So the guy friends that she's with decide to pull a prank on Buddy. And Buddy's out in the water flailing around, and Maria gets concerned. And they realize that Buddy is naked because the boys depantsed him and he was forced to run out to the water. And he's out there in the freezing cold water making a whole scene. Everybody's watching and laughing. And Maria's trying to give, his trunks back to him. She throws them out into the ocean, and Buddy's struggling with it. And then all of her friends and her decide to kind of walk off and let Buddy just deal with it on his own, which is kind of cruel. And when they get back, they're still hanging out, and one of the boys convinces her to kind of blow off Buddy, because her and Buddy had made some plans to maybe go on a date that night, go around town. And she's like, yeah, I'll do that. But they didn't know that Buddy was listening in on the conversation, which plays a role into the next event. So what happens is Maria and her friends, they kind of double date. They go out to this drive-in and they have a good time. But the next day, everything's kind of weird. Maria and her friend Amy encounter this boy, Buddy. And Buddy, Maria's like thinking, oh, I blew Buddy off. I have to apologize for blowing him off. But Buddy already knows the truth behind it. And he's trying to pretend like nothing ever happened and says, hey, let's go for a swim. And Maria's like, the water's too cold. I don't think that's a good idea. And he's like, no, let's go. And I guess Maria, feeling bad for blowing Buddy off, decides to go, just entertain hanging out with him to kind of make it up to him. So Buddy kind of takes Maria, separates her from Amy, and they head off closer to his beach house, and they head out into the water where there's a bunch of fog and the water's very cold. And they get out very far. And Buddy essentially, I'm going to kind of skim over some details here because I don't want to spoil too much. Essentially corners Maria and says, you humiliated me. You and your friends are all going to pay for this. And Maria's like, you're scaring me. And he's like, well, we're out here, and they see some shark fins, and he's like, you're going to become shark food. He pulls out a knife and brutally stabs her and leaves her for dead and swims off. And basically what happens is there's a time jump after Buddy hits the beach and kind of makes a joke in some morbid way that he just left Maria behind. We get a time jump to 1992 with a brand new character named Ashley. Now this is how the story goes. You end off on a cliffhanger in 1956, and then you jump to 1992. So in 1992 in Dunehampton, there's this girl named Ashley. She's like a 16-year-old kid, around the same age as Maria. And she's there with her boyfriend that she's dating, Ross. And they're hanging out with with this couple that they're friends with, Lucy and this other guy. And they're kind of like a close-knit group, but Ross has a jealousy problem because Ashley apparently is unbelievably hot, and all these guys want to be with her. And same thing with her friend Lucy. So yeah, he can have worse problems, I guess. But he's a control freak with her, and that plays a role in the story later on, some drama. But Ashley, she gets picked up by this guy that she's known since second grade. He's kind of like this jock type, right? And he throws her in the water. And Ashley's really pissed off at Ross about not sticking up for her. And Ross gets jealous that apparently she might have liked being picked up. Yeah, it's stuff like that. But once you get past that stuff, they have this encounter with this rich guy, and his name is Brad. And Brad is said to live in these mansions nearby Dunehampton, and they're really nice. And Ashley seems to kind of have a mild flirtation crush with him and is kind of enamored by his money. And her boyfriend calls her out on it and is like, you're just trying to get with him because he's rich, and, we can't take his offer seriously going to go to his house and stuff, because obviously to him, he thinks that going to his house will, make him the third wheel and his own girlfriend's going to like leave him or something. Ross is kind of annoying. But Ashley has to put up with him and, says maybe we'll put a pin in it for later to Brad. And Brad goes off and does his own thing. Well, you get into this idea that Ross and Ashley are kind of like the voyeuristic type, where they like to like venture off, and they made like this love pact that they're going to have a romantic summer together in Dunehampton. But it gets chilly later one night. It starts to kind of rain a little bit. So they find themselves wandering down the beach, and they see the same beach house that we saw from 1956. The one that you see on the cover, unusually close to the beach. Except this time, there's, the house looks a whole lot more disheveled. I should honestly mention this because I kind of skimmed over this because I don't want to get into too many spoilers. But when Maria was left for dead, there was a police investigation done that I kind of skimmed over, but they couldn't find any trace of either Buddy or Maria. And the house that Buddy was staying in looked relatively unlived in, and nobody had ever lived there. The furniture looked like freshly placed. The decks looked freshly built. The house was never lived in whatsoever. At this point in time, in Ashley and Ross's time period in 1992, one of the windows got smashed in. There's rot on the floor. All the furniture is outdated, right? And there's no electricity to it. So the house is kind of creepy, but they go in there for shelter, and they end up interacting with their friend Lucy and her boyfriend, but they strangely ended up disappearing near the end, and that's where it cliff hangs. After they leave their friends and they head back to where they're staying, they realize the next morning their friends are missing. So it cuts back into 1956, and this time we get to see Amy kind of leading the perspective since Maria was left for dead by Buddy. And Amy and the other two guys that they're friends with, they're hanging out, and they realize that the whole mood is shot in the summer. The summer's pretty much ruined at this point. And I'm going to kind of skim through this because we're going to get into some mild spoilers here. But let's say Buddy kind of comes back and pretends like he just escaped for a few days once he told his mom about what happened. And Amy's like, well, the cops are looking for you. And he's like, well, I talked with them over the phone, giving him some weird excuse. But Amy and her friends kind of buy into it and don't think much of Buddy. And one of the guys goes off to do some like soul searching because apparently he was really close with Maria. And when he does that, he, let's say, doesn't come back, because later that day, as soon as Buddy comes back into town, they find this guy's body, and apparently his head was smashed in with like a plank nearby. And Amy and her friend, I think it's Robbie, are the two left over. They're mortified by this realization. And then it cuts back to Ashley and Ross. So Ashley and Ross, dealing with the disappearance of their friends, realize that there's nothing really much they can do, but they keep getting into fights and spats and arguments. And they had this other altercation with this guy that tried to pick her up and throw her into the water. And this kind of escalates tensions between them. And Ashley starts to kind of realize in her mind, this connection that she might have with this Brad guy, and how she's kind of getting pushed away by Ross with her perceived nature of him. She realizes that they don't really click. She's an attractive woman. She likes to flirt with men, but he's kind of possessive and jealous. So they just don't mix well. And you have to deal with that for a little bit. But it kind of escalates when they decide to finally go to Brad's house and accept the invitation. And they go there and they meet this maid named Mary. And Mary is kind of weird and, very creepy and kind of like keeping a watchful eye on them. But nonetheless, they go out into the backyard. They meet up with Brad and his cousin, and they're going to play a game of tennis. But after Brad comes on a little too strong with Ashley, this causes Ross to like leave. And Ashley's like, well, I'm not going to chase after him. I'm going to stop dating him. It's whatever. This summer of romance is over. And Ashley pretty much decides that she's going to pick up and basically just be with Brad. So when we go back to 1956, Amy is struggling with the idea that her friends are kind of turning up, disappearing, and getting murdered and stuff. And her and her friend Robbie are chatting one day, and Robbie has to go back to like a barbecue that his parents are throwing for the town. And when he leaves, she pretty much is left alone on the beach because the beach gets rained out, and she's getting ready to go back, but she's confronted by this other guy that she didn't know in the distance, but when she comes close, she realizes that it's Buddy. And Buddy's acting very weird. He's like, oh, the weather's getting bad. Here, why don't we go back to, why don't we go do this? And Amy's caught off guard by doing that, like I think it was going for a swim. She's like, why can't we just go inside? It's cold. And Buddy's like, all right. So Buddy lets her back to his beach house, and they decide to go back inside. But there, Buddy essentially reveals a grisly truth to Amy about his motivations with her. And he basically comes clean and says, well, your friend Maria, this other guy, and Robbie, they're all dead because of me. And I'm going to have to kill you now for revenge. And there's this whole grisly scene of her trying to escape, and it's kind of sad and morbid. But let's just say Buddy ends up like tying her to one of the pylons beneath the beach house and essentially leaves her there. And he has like this whole psychotic speech saying that, oh, you guys left me naked in the cold water. I'm going to do the same to you like you did to me. So you could tell that his ego was bruised, and that was kind of like his motive for killing. And he pretty much leaves her there, and we don't really get to see what happens to her, but it's implied that she ends up dying, essentially. So back in present day, Ashley and Brad had like this, kindling romance. They've gone on a few dates off page a little bit. It's not really important. But she starts to get she got a frantic phone call that sounded kind of eerie, saying to stay away from Brad. And she's followed this in the back of her mind. She's like, all right, well, who could be saying this stuff, right? And it turns out that she might be getting stalked by her ex-boyfriend, Ross, who's kind of following her around Dunehampton while she's going out with this guy, Brad. And this leads up to the climax of the story, where Brad decides that since they've gone on a few dates, it's time for him to come clean with a secret that he's been keeping. And Brad says that he comes from a family of explorers, and his lineage has gone exploring to the point where they come across innovations, and that's how his great-grandparents got rich, and how he's been able to afford living an affluent lifestyle. And he kind of comes clean about his his younger brother that he idolized, even though he's a younger brother. And his younger brother died in a tragic, messed up accident going exploring inside of this house. And he fell through an unfinished floor down 2 stories and broke his neck on the concrete below, which was really graphic. But he's gone into like herb exploration because he wants to be like his younger brother. So he's found something inside of the beach house he wants to show Ashley. And Ashley's very weirded out because her friends disappeared shortly after being in the beach house. And I should mention this, her and Ross, I think, go back there and find a scarf at one point, but that's not really too important, but that does play a role into her apprehension to go back there with Brad. And once they get to the house, Brad's demeanor changes. He becomes very possessive and like trying to force her through like, against her will to go into this specific room in this closet of sorts that kind of jettisons out closest to the water where the fog constantly meets the beach house, because this is apparently a place where fog is constantly rolling over the waves on this beach. And she's weirded out and she's kind of forced in there. And they noted that there's a smell of gasoline everywhere, but they can't pinpoint why. But they're greeted by, let's say, a figure inside of the closet. And this closet is a massive thing that apparently this fog rolls in from outside into the closet itself as well. And apparently it like swirls up and it becomes like kind of supernatural from this point. Somebody's waiting there. And this person may or may not be a character from 1956 and from the present. There's a certain person that has like, I don't want to spoil exactly what it is because I'll give away the whole book. But there's a recontextualization about the events of 1956. Somebody maybe didn't die, maybe had found a certain way to mask their real identity because of what happened to them in the present time, and gives backstory on how they were able to do all this. And this flabbergasts Brad, because Brad, this might be a mild spoiler, might be very closely related, if not the same person, as Buddy from the past. And I'll leave it there. And you'll learn exactly what that entails. And essentially, something happens to where Ashley, by a stroke of luck and circumstance, happens to get out of the story alive. And her ex-boyfriend Ross, I guess, get back together, and they try to find, some happiness after their whole summer of misfortune. And that's kind of where the story pretty much wraps up. And that's essentially what you're going to expect out of Beach House in a nutshell. There's a lot of fillerness to the book, but I don't really consider it fillerness in the sense that, it's not important to talk about, but there's just so much that happens in the story. I had to skim the surface. And of course, if I go into depth into too many things, I'll be spoiling the entire story for you. So I try to keep it as surface level as possible. But I hope you got the gist of it all. Nonetheless, let's start off with the positives of the book. Okay, so Beach House here. What I loved about this was the construction of the story. I loved how Stine was able to write like 25 to 35-ish, maybe sometimes 40 pages of one time period. And then he'll shoot to the future, then back to the past. It created a story environment where you're actually involved and invested into two separate storylines, and you're curious to see how this all connects by the end. And I think the crescendo and the anticipation building that Stine was able to do with this book was next level. I really dug that about this book. And I think what helps that is the fact that he made it so entertaining. Yeah, there are some characters that have some iffy qualities, like Ross being a possessive boyfriend. He's not a great character. The jerk-off jock guy that throws Ashley in the beach, it's not likable. Even Ashley, at a point, isn't all that likable because of some decisions and some egging on she does to Ross. It's kind of annoying. Brad's kind of a jerk. I mean, all these characters have some jerky qualities to them. Even back in the past, when we're dealing with Maria, Amy, Robbie, and the other guy, they're all jerks. Buddy is kind of weird. They all have quirks about them that are unlikable. But then again, strangely enough, you feel sympathy for all of them at some point of the story. And I think that's really great writing, especially when you're writing a third-person story. And not to mention, the setting and the atmosphere definitely helps sell the periphery of the story. And I think when it comes down to it, this book is a great example of Stine being able to add a bunch of small scenes together. I mean, this was like a bunch of small scenes adding up and adding up and adding up all the way to the climax. Some people might consider that filler, like I said. And it can be considered that. Honestly, you can probably trim out maybe 10 or 15 pages of that and be just fine with this book. But it was still entertaining. For a young adult thriller type of story, I was genuinely entertained by some of the drama here. Because, you don't get any character perspectives or anything, but you get a sense of, what these characters are like and how they interact with people. And I don't know, it's just a different way to characterize characters that I don't really see Stine doing all that much. So I can appreciate it for that. And in a lot of ways, it made this a refreshing book from him, at least from my experience. Now, I can't say that he can try this same idea of filling it with drama and try to make it entertaining and it kind of fail with other books. But in this specific situation, I think it did work splendidly well. The moments in this book, especially dealing with Buddy, happens to be, I think, one of the most, his motives for killing is kind of silly when you kind of think about it, but what he does is so ruthless. I mean, there's legitimate body counts in this book that I was not expecting to see, and just how visceral it was to read basically a psychopath, terrorize a couple of teens in the past, and how that plays a role in the future is nuts to me, right? Yeah, I was floored with this character, and the plot twist reveal dealing with Buddy and the realization of that threw me for a loop. I mean, I kind of saw there was going to be maybe some connection there, but I didn't see the connection that they made with the story here. That blew me away. There's a supernatural element that might deal with pseudo time travel, but it's like ultra specific about it, and I was not expecting that. I was like, wow, okay, there we go. Whatever. And Stine actually made effort to explain it all, which was really nice. That leads me to the climax of the story. I think the climax is just so out there and so weird, but I freaking love it. I love that Stine just had to make it extra weird. And this is one of those situations that if you take this book like a serious tone book and you're like, oh, this book is grounded in realism, that climax is going to throw you for a loop because you're not going to see it coming, and it might be out of left field for a lot of you. But to me, for one time only, I'll let the out of left field slide for Stine here, because that was actually kind of a fun way to connect the 1956 and 1992 stuff. But at the same time, it also served like a moment for a character that we thought that died that actually survived and lived on. And I thought that was incredible. I thought that was legitimately incredible. And the motives and all that made, for the most part, logical sense, minus one element, which is going to be my one and only negative. But yeah, this was a surprising climax, and I absolutely loved it. And the way the ending wrapped up put a nice little bow on the story. I think it ended in a fine way for what this book was. Now, my one negative with this is a part of the climax dealing with the revelations under the character that is said to have survived Buddy's attacks back in 1956. There's one thing about it that makes no logical sense, and I guess we're going to have to do a mild major spoiler here. The time travel element of the story basically involves some part of the house, and where the house is built is like a doorway to a specific timeline, time portal that goes from 1992 specifically to 1956 only. Now, the way this character described it, she or he survived 1956, lived on for a few years, and sometime in the 1960s saw Buddy back at the same beach house, time traveling to the 60s. That doesn't make any sense. The book said it only goes to 1956, but the character saw them in the 60s. It makes no logical sense. But because of that, apparently this caused the character to do what Buddy's character was doing, to go back to 1956 and then find a way to get back to present time where they've aged quite a few years. It is what it is. It's very weird, but that part of the revelation doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Other than that, I think this book was very, very, very good. I mean, this was a great read. Definitely an A-tier Stine book. Not quite perfect. I can't overlook that issue. But from a 0 to 5 star basis, because I don't do exact ratings for, young adult or adult horror, I'm going to give this because I do 0.5 and 0.25 increments, I will give this maybe like a 4.75 out of 5 stars, which is pushing a 5 out of 5. But like I said, that part of the revelation near the end kind of holds it back. But yeah, still a very, very great book. Highly recommend it to you all that you need to check this out. Please go read this thing. So yeah, that's my thoughts on R.L. Stine's Beach House from Point Horror. Let me know down in the comment section if you've read this book before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.